The morning she lost everything, Shauna's hands were steady. She pressed the last of the calendula paste into the clay jar, working the golden mixture with her thumb until the surface was smooth and sealed. The jar was small, barely enough to fill a cupped palm, but the tincture inside it had taken 11 days to brew. Wild calendula, harvested under a waning moon, steeped in rendered tallow, and the bark of an old elm she'd had to climb to reach. It was her best work, the kind of salve that could close a wound in hours instead of days, the kind that made the pack physician Elroy narrow his eyes and mutter about her kitchen tricks, even as he quietly restocked his own shelves from her supply. She set the jar on the wooden rack beside the others, a neat row of amber and clay vessels, each one labeled in her careful hand. Remedies for burns, for fevers, for the deep muscle tears that came after a bad shift. The pack used them all. The pack needed them all. What the pack did not need, as it turned out, was Shauna. She didn't know that yet, not in the way that mattered. She suspected it the way a person suspects rain when the air goes heavy, a pressure behind her sternum, a feeling of something gathering. But suspicion is not the same as certainty, and certainty is not the same as hearing it spoken aloud in front of every wolf you've ever known. That part came later. That part came in less than an hour. And the jar she'd just sealed, the one with the perfect calendula salve, would sit on that shelf untouched for days, waiting in the dark of her abandoned cabin for a purpose she could not yet imagine. The summons came through Renee, Zayden's beta, who appeared at her door with the expression of a man asked to deliver a package he suspected was a bomb. Renee was not unkind. That was the worst part about him. He looked at Shauna with something close to pity. And pity from a man like Renee, blunt, practical, allergic to sentiment, was its own kind of warning. Pack assembly. The alphas called full attendance. He paused. You should come now. I'm finishing a batch. Now, Shauna. She wiped her hands on the cloth at her hip and followed him out. The border fox was there, as it always was, a rangy, half-grown thing with a torn ear and rust-colored fur that had never quite decided if it wanted to be red or brown. It sat at the edge of the tree line where Shauna's garden met the forest, watching her with its head tilted. The fox had no name. Shauna had never named it because naming it would have meant admitting she needed something that needed her back, and admitting need in Hollow Creek was just handing people a sharper knife. But the fox came every morning. It ate the scraps she left on the flat stone by her door. It tolerated her presence with the calm indifference of a creature that had never learned to read scent, because border foxes couldn't, not the way wolves did. To every wolf in Hollow Creek, Shauna smelled like nothing, like absence, like a window left open in an empty room. But to the fox, she was just a warm thing that left food, and that was enough. The fox watched her go. It did not follow. Not yet. The gathering circle sat at the center of Hollow Creek, a natural depression in the land ringed by birch trees whose bark had been carved with pack sigils over generations. Shauna had always thought the circle was beautiful in the way that old, dangerous things are beautiful. The way a cliff is beautiful, or the open mouth of a cave. You admired it best from a distance. She did not have that luxury today. Every wolf in the pack stood in the ring, shoulders tight, eyes forward. The air was thick with mingled scents she couldn't read. Anxiety, excitement, dominance, submission. All the invisible language her body had never learned to speak. She was fluent in the language of plants, of tinctures, of the slow alchemy of healing. But the language her own kind spoke through skin and breath and the oil at the nape of the neck had always been silence to her. And their silence toward her had always been answer enough. Zayden stood at the center. Her mate. Her alpha. The word sat wrong in her mouth even now, 3 years into a bond that had never hummed, never pulled, never done any of the things the old wolves said a true bond should do. Xaden was tall and broad in the way alphas were supposed to be. Dark-haired, square-jawed, built like something designed to stand between danger and everyone else. He had chosen her in a moment of political calculation. Shauna's tinctures were valuable, her bloodline old if minor, and at the time, no one had yet confirmed what Elroy would later announce with the gravity of a death sentence. That she was barren. That her body carried none of the markers. That she was, in the physician's measured words, reproductively incompatible with continuation of the alpha line. Xaden had not touched her since the diagnosis. 8 months of sleeping in the same cabin, eating at the same table, moving through the same days, and the distance between them had grown so wide she could have planted a garden in it. She almost had. She'd spent those months in her workshop instead, brewing, distilling, cataloging, making herself useful in the only way that was left to her, and pretending she didn't hear the whispers. She heard them now, a rustle of murmured conversation as she took her place at the edge of the circle. The subtle shift of bodies away from her, the way wolves do when someone carries a scent they find unpleasant or, worse, no scent at all. Wilma, the pack's head scout, cut a glance at her and then away. Beside Wilma stood her sister, Daphne, whose lips moved in a whisper Shauna didn't need wolf hearing to decode. She'd heard it before. Hollow, empty, broken wolf. The words had stopped hurting months ago, or she'd gotten better at pretending they had, which amounted to the same thing. On the outside, and nothing at all on the inside. Xaden raised his hand, and the circle fell silent. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of an alpha's authority, the resonance that vibrated in the chest and made lesser wolves want to bare their throats. Shauna had never felt it. Another deficit, another absence in the long catalog of things her body refused to do. I've called you here to address the future of this pack. His eyes swept the circle. They did not land on her. A pack without an heir is a pack without a future. I have consulted with Elroy, with the elders, and with the council. The decision is unanimous. Now his gaze found her, and what she saw in it was not cruelty exactly, but something worse. Resolution. The look of a man who had already made peace with what he was about to do, and resented her for making it necessary. I am invoking the severance rite. My bond with Shauna of the Wren line is dissolved, on grounds of reproductive failure. Daphne of the Birch line has agreed to stand as the pack's new Luna. The circle did not gasp. That was the part that broke something in Shauna. Not the words, which she had half expected, but the silence that followed them, the comfortable, unsurprised silence of people who had known this was coming, who had perhaps been waiting for it, who saw the severing of her bond not as a tragedy, but as a correction, the removal of a flawed part so the machine could run clean again. Daphne stepped forward, her chin high, her scent, Shauna assumed, broadcasting exactly the right cocktail of fertility and readiness and submission. Daphne was everything Shauna was not. Present, legible, whole in the way the pack defined wholeness. Renee stood to Xaden's left, his jaw set. He did not look at Shauna. She thought she saw his hand tighten at his side, but she could not be sure, and it did not matter, because tightened hands that do nothing are just fists. The severance carries a condition, Xaden continued, and here his voice dropped, not softer but heavier, the way a stone sounds when it lands in deep water. Under pack law, a severed mate without bloodline standing or offspring claim forfeits territorial protection. Shauna is released beyond the warded border, effective at sundown. Released. The word they used when they meant exiled. The word they used when they wanted to feel clean about sending someone into the old territory. the unpatrolled miles of forest and ruin that stretched north beyond the pack's warding stones, where the ancient things lived, where wolves did not go because the things that had made wolves still walked there and did not welcome their descendants. Shauna's hands, which had been steady all morning, began to shake. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there, and she looked at Xaden, really looked at him, not at the alpha or the title or the broad shoulders that were supposed to mean safety. And she said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had made her useful and then made her nothing, and the pack had watched both transformations with the same polite silence. She turned and walked out of the circle. No one followed her. No one called her name. She packed what she could carry: herbs, tools, the leather roll of her blending knives, a wool cloak that had belonged to her mother, a skin of water, a handful of dried meat she knew would last 2 days if she was careful. She did not pack the clay jar of calendula salve. She thought about it, her hand hovering over the neat row on the shelf, but something made her leave it, a feeling she couldn't name. The sense that taking it would mean she believed she'd need to heal someone, and right now, she could not bear to believe in anyone's wounds but her own. The fox was waiting when she stepped outside. It sat on the flat stone where she left scraps, its torn ear twitching. And when Shauna walked past the last cabin and toward the warding stones at the northern edge of the territory, the fox stood and followed. Not close, it kept 10 paces behind her, trotting in the undergrowth with its belly low. But it followed, and it kept following as she crossed the ward line and felt the hum of the boundary stones pass over her skin, like the memory of a hand that had once held hers, and then let go. The old territory was not what she expected. She had been raised on stories of ruin and darkness, of the land beyond the wards as a cursed place where the original wolves had torn each other apart in wars so old the trees had grown over the battlefields. And the trees had grown. Massive, ancient, their canopies so thick, the light that filtered through was green gold and cathedral dim. But the ground beneath them was not dead. It was wild in the way things are wild when they have been left alone long enough to remember what they were before anyone tried to tame them. Ferns grew waist-high. Moss covered everything in a soft green fur. She found water within the first hour, a clear stream that tasted like stone and snow melt, and beside it a hollow between 2 root systems that was dry and sheltered and large enough for a small fire. She made camp. The fox circled the hollow 3 times and then settled at the entrance, its nose on its paws, watching the darkening forest with the patient alertness of a creature that had always lived on the margin between territories. Shauna sat with her back against the roots and pressed her palms against her face and let herself feel it, the full weight of what had been done to her. Not just the rejection, the years of it, the slow, patient erosion of being told in 1,000 small ways that she was less, that her body's silence was a moral failing, that the healing she poured into every jar and tincture and salve was a consolation prize for the real value she could not produce. She cried. She cried the way healers cry, which is to say, thoroughly, efficiently, and with the understanding that the body processes grief like a toxin, and the fastest way through is to let it move. When she was done, she washed her face in the stream, rebuilt her small fire, and slept. She woke to the fox growling. It was a thin, rattling sound, nothing like a wolf's growl, more like a tea kettle with a crack in it. But the meaning was clear. Something was close. Shauna sat up and reached for her blending knife, the sharpest one, the one she used for stripping bark. And then the undergrowth parted, and the something stepped into the light of her dying fire, and she understood, in a single, frozen moment, that everything she'd been told about the old territory was wrong, and also not nearly enough. He was enormous. Not in the way Zayden was large, which was the cultivated, genetic largeness of an alpha bred for dominance. This was something older. He stood at the edge of the firelight, as if the darkness had shaped itself into a man, and then thought better of it halfway through. And the result was a figure that was human in structure, that carried in every line the memory of something that had never been merely human. His shoulders were broader than seemed structurally sound. His eyes caught the firelight and held it, not reflecting it the way wolf eyes did, but absorbing it, so that his irises glowed a deep, steady amber that had nothing to do with the moon or the shift. His hair was dark, longer than packmen wore theirs, tied back from a face that was all angles and old scars. And his hands. She noticed his hands because she was a healer, and hands were the first thing she cataloged about anyone. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, and large enough to close around her entire forearm, and they hung loose at his sides in the posture of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. The fox had stopped growling. It sat very still, its torn ear flat against its skull, but it did not run. Neither did Shauna. She held the knife in front of her and said, "I've crossed the ward line. I know this isn't pack territory. If you want me to move on, I will at first light." He studied her. Not the way wolves studied each other, with the quick scent read that told them everything they needed to know about rank and fertility and threat level. He studied her the way she studied a plant she hadn't seen before, carefully, with curiosity, with the patience of someone who knew that the most important things revealed themselves slowly. "You're from the southern pack." His voice was low, not rough the way she expected, but deep, with a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere below his chest, as if the sound originated in the ground beneath him and merely used his throat as a channel. "Hollow Creek." I was from Hollow Creek. His head tilted. The gesture was so like the fox's that Shauna almost laughed, and the almost laugh startled her, because she hadn't thought she had any laughter left. "You carry no pack scent. I carry no scent at all. That's why I'm here." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She was so tired of pity she could have choked on it. But recognition. The kind of look a locksmith gives a lock he's seen before, one everyone else has declared jammed, and he already knows the problem is that they've been using the wrong key. "What's your name?" "Shauna, of the Wren line, if that matters to anyone anymore." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. The fox inched forward on its belly until it was pressed against Shauna's knee, a warm, trembling weight that grounded her. "It matters." He stepped closer, and the firelight caught the full map of scars across his forearms. Old wounds laid over older wounds. A history of violence written on skin. But he moved carefully, telegraphing every step, the way you move around a creature you don't want to frighten. "The Wren line hasn't surfaced in 4 generations. Your wolves forgot what it was. My wolves forgot a lot of things, starting with me." He crouched at the edge of her fire, keeping the flames between them. This close, she could see that the amber in his eyes wasn't uniform. It moved, slow currents of gold in a darker field, like sunlight through deep water. "I am Alaric." No title, no rank, no posturing, just the name, offered like a hand extended in the dark. "This territory is mine. You're welcome in it." "Why?" The question seemed to surprise him, or maybe it pleased him. His mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Because you crossed the ward line alone, armed with a bark-stripping knife, and your fox hasn't bolted." He glanced at the animal pressed against her leg. "Border foxes don't trust anything that smells like a predator. Yours is asleep." Shauna looked down. The fox was, in fact, asleep, its cracked ear twitching in some small dream, its breath warm against her knee. It had never done that before. At Hollow Creek, even beside Shauna, it had always slept with one eye open. She looked back at Alaric, and the question in her chest was not about trust or territory or the politics of exile. It was simpler than that. What are you? What your wolves used to be, before they forgot. He didn't explain further that night. He built her fire back up with the efficient motions of a man who'd spent centuries tending flames alone. He set a ward of his own around the hollow, not a stone ward like the packs, but something older, a low, humming vibration she felt in her molars, in the roots of her hair. A sound below hearing that made the fox sigh in its sleep. And then he left, moving back into the forest with a silence that should have been impossible for a man his size. And Shauna lay awake for a long time, listening to the ward hum around her like a second heartbeat, and wondering why, for the first time in years, the ache behind her sternum, the one she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't normal, had gone quiet. Like a wound that stops aching when the right hands are near it. She told herself it meant nothing. She almost believed it. Morning came gray and cool, mist threading through the ancient trees like something alive. Shauna woke to find the fox sitting at the edge of the hollow with a rabbit at its feet, freshly caught, presented with the smug pride of a creature that had never in its short life managed to catch anything larger than a beetle. She cleaned and cooked it over the rebuilt fire, saving half the meat and hanging it in a cloth from a branch. Survival first, questions second. That was the healer's way. Alaric returned at mid-morning, and he brought answers without being asked, which she appreciated more than she would admit. He walked her through the forest to a place where the trees opened into a clearing, and at the center of the clearing stood a structure that was not a castle and not a ruin, but something between. A great hall of dark stone, its walls wound through with living vines, its roof half open to the sky, its doorways arched in a style she'd only seen in the oldest pack carvings, the ones no one could read anymore. Inside, the hall was warm despite the open roof. Firelight from a central hearth filled the space with a flickering amber glow, and the walls were lined with shelves, and on the shelves, Shauna stopped walking. Jars, hundreds of them. Clay and glass and carved stone, some so old they were opaque with mineral deposits, others newer, carefully labeled in a script she didn't recognize. Tinctures, salves, dried bundles of herbs she knew, and herbs she didn't. Roots and barks and resins, arranged with the methodical care of someone who understood that healing was not magic, but patience. "You're a healer," she whispered. "I was, a long time ago." He stood by the hearth, watching her discover his shelves the way a man watches someone walk through a room he'd forgotten anyone else might want to see. "Now I'm the last of a line, living in the house my line built, tending a territory no one comes to." "Why not?" "Because the wolves who descended from us chose to forget us. They built their wards and their hierarchies and their scent reading and their fertility metrics, and they decided that what came before was primitive, dangerous, something to wall off." He picked up a jar from the nearest shelf, turning it in his scarred hands. "They're not entirely wrong. What I am is dangerous. But dangerous is not the same as monstrous, and your pack lost the ability to tell the difference 300 years ago." Shauna moved along the shelves, her healer's eye cataloging, comparing, marveling. Some of these preparations were so old, they'd calcite sealed themselves into their containers, but others were fresh, recent, made with the same care she brought to her own work. She reached out and touched a jar of what she was almost certain was moonwort extract, preserved in the suspension she'd never seen before, and her fingertips tingled. "You can feel that." Not a question. Alaric set down the jar he was holding and looked at her with that same careful attention, that same recognition. The resonance in the preparation. "I've always been able to feel it. I thought everyone could." He crossed the distance between them, not quickly, not aggressively, but with the deliberate certainty of a man closing the last steps of a very long journey. He stopped an arm's length away and held out his hand, palm up. "May I?" She didn't know what he was asking permission for. She gave it anyway, placing her hand in his, and the moment her skin touched his, she understood two things simultaneously, like two doors opening in the same wall. The first was that the tingling she'd felt in the moonwort jar was the same vibration she felt now, amplified 100-fold, a resonance that hummed through her palm and up her arm and settled in her chest where the ache had lived for years. The ache that was, even now, still quiet, still held. The second thing she understood was that Alaric was shaking, not with fear or cold or effort, but with the fine, barely visible tremor of a man holding himself very, very still, because the alternative was to move in ways he was not sure she'd welcome. He let go of her hand. The tremor stopped. The resonance dimmed but didn't vanish, settling into a low warmth behind her ribs, like an ember banked but not extinguished. "Your walls read fertility through scent," he said, and his voice was steady, even if his hands were not. "They use pheromone signatures to determine reproductive compatibility. It's a blunt instrument, effective for their purposes, but blunt." Elroy said, "I carry no markers." "You carry no wolf markers. That's not the same thing." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that the next sentence would change her life and wanted to be precise about it. "The Wren line is one of the oldest in the Southern Territories. Old enough to predate the wolf-Lycan split. Old enough to carry dormant Lycan blood." Shauna's hand closed at her side. "I'm not a Lycan." "No. You're a wolf with a Lycan ghost in her bloodline, and that ghost has been sitting on your fertility like a hand over a candle flame for your entire life. Your body doesn't produce wolf-readable markers because it's not calibrated for wolf offspring. It never was." His eyes held hers, and in the amber light she could see the weight of what he was telling her. Not just the biological fact of it, but the years of her life it retroactively rewrote. Every diagnosis, every pitying glance, every whispered, hollow, empty, broken. All of it wrong. Not broken, locked, waiting for a key that didn't exist in Hollow Creek because Hollow Creek had walled off the only door it fit. She sat down on the stone bench beside the hearth because her legs made the decision for her. The fox appeared from somewhere. It had followed them to the hall and had been investigating the corners with intense, silent focus, and climbed into her lap, curling against her stomach. She buried her fingers in its rough fur. "You're telling me I'm not Barren. I'm telling you that you never were. And I'm telling you something else, because you deserve to hear it plainly." He crouched in front of her, bringing his eyes level with hers, and the firelight carved his scars into deep relief. "A Lycan heir has not been born in over a century. The bloodlines that could carry one have died out or diluted beyond viability. All of them. Except yours." The weight of it pressed on her chest like a stone. Not the honor of it. She didn't feel honored. She felt dizzy. But the absurdity, the cruel, structural absurdity of a woman thrown away for the very thing that made her rare. "The pack declared me worthless," she said quietly. "Xaden severed our bond in front of everyone. I know. I felt the ward line open when you crossed it. I've felt every exile Hollow Creek has pushed through that border in 300 years." Something moved behind his expression. Old anger banked low. "Most of them don't survive the first night. You built a fire and cataloged edible plants by moonlight. I'm a healer. Surviving is just applied botany." The almost smile again, closer to real this time, warming the edges of his scarred face in a way that made her breath catch, for reasons she was not prepared to examine. Over the next hours, he showed her the rest of his territory, not as a lord displaying holdings, but as a man showing someone where the good water was, which paths were safe at dusk, where the old growth gave way to meadow, and the meadow to the ruins of what had once been a Lycan city, its bones now furred with moss and wildflowers. He moved through the forest the way the trees did, rooted, patient, part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. And he talked. Not about himself, not about power or lineage or the things alphas talked about, but about the land. The soil composition in the eastern meadow, the migration patterns of the elk herds, the particular quality of light at the solstice, when the old stones in the ruined city still hummed with the residual energy of rites no one performed anymore. Shauna listened, and she asked questions, and she watched the way he answered, carefully, completely, with the attention of a man who had not had anyone to answer to in a very long time, and was relearning the shape of conversation. She noticed that he kept distance between them, not coldness, but space, room for her to move, to breathe, to choose. After 3 years with Zayden, who had filled every room with the gravitational pull of his authority, Alaric's restraint felt like oxygen. That night, she slept in a room he'd prepared in the hall, a simple space with a bed of layered furs, a basin of water, a window that opened onto the forest canopy. The fox curled at her feet. The ward hummed around the hall like a lullaby, sung in a language she didn't speak but somehow understood. And in her sleep, she dreamed of roots, vast, interconnected root systems stretching beneath the forest floor, linking every tree to every other tree, a network of silent communication that had been there all along, beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen. She woke knowing something had changed, not in the world, in her. It was a warmth, low and deep, centered in her abdomen, like a coal that had caught in the night. She pressed her hand there and felt it pulse, not painfully, not urgently, but with the steady, unmistakable rhythm of something beginning. She was a healer. She knew her own body the way a carpenter knows the grain of familiar wood. And she knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and landed somewhere in the marrow of her bones, what that warmth meant. She found Alaric in the central hall, grinding dried root at a stone table. His hand stilled when she entered. He looked at her face and then at the hand she held against her stomach, and something fractured behind his eyes. Not breaking apart, but breaking open, the way ice fractures in a spring river, making way for what moves beneath. "You feel it," he said. "Yes." He set down the pestle. He did not cross to her. He did not reach for her. He stood very still, and his voice, when it came, was rough in a way that had nothing to do with authority, and everything to do with the specific sound a man makes when hope, the kind he'd stopped allowing himself, forces its way back up through years of scar tissue. "Shauna, I need you to understand what this means, and I need you to understand it as information, not as a demand." She waited. A Lycan heir, born of dormant blood and living blood, hasn't occurred since the founding age. The child you're carrying will be the first true blood Lycan, born in over 100 years. It will carry gifts, healing, warding, the old resonance that have been extinct in the wolf packs for generations. "Gifts," she repeated. "The kind that can restore what's been corrupted. The kind that can break a blight." The word snagged. Blight. She'd heard it whispered in Hollow Creek for the past year. A sickness in the land. A slow poisoning of the wards and the soil and the wolves themselves. A decay that Elroy couldn't diagnose and Zayden couldn't fight. Wolves getting weaker. Pups born smaller. The game moving farther from the borders. She'd been trying to brew tinctures for it in her workshop. She'd been working on stronger healing salves when the summons came. The jar on the shelf, the calendula salve, her best work, brewed for a wound she hadn't been able to name. You're telling me the blight is killing Hollow Creek. I'm telling you the blight is killing all the southern packs. It's been building for decades. The wards they use are degraded copies of Lycan warding, and without the original resonance to renew them, they decay. The decay poisons the land. The land poisons the wolves. Your pack physician blames weak bloodlines and barren mates because he doesn't understand the actual pathology. A pause. He especially doesn't understand that the one wolf he declared defective is the only one whose blood carries the cure. Shauna sat down. The fox materialized from beneath a table and pressed against her ankles. She looked at Alaric, this ancient, scarred, careful man who had not once in 2 days told her what to do, or what she owed, or what she was for. And she asked the question that had been forming since the moment he held her hand, and the ache went silent. What do you want from me? He met her eyes. The amber currents moved slowly, deliberately, like a man choosing his words from a deep well. I want you to stay. Not because of the child, not because of the bloodline, because this hall has been quiet for 100 years, and yesterday you touched a jar of moonwort and felt its resonance, and you are the first person in my living memory who has done that. Because you slept in my territory, and your fox slept with both eyes closed. His voice dropped, not to a whisper but to something lower, something that came from the place where his resonance lived. I want you to stay, but I will not ask you to. What you do, what the child means, who benefits from it, those are your decisions. I've seen what happens when someone else makes them for you. She didn't answer immediately. She sat with it the way she sat with a new tincture, letting it settle, watching for the reaction, testing whether it burned or healed. And she thought about Xaden, about the circle, about the comfortable silence of wolves who had watched her discarded like a cracked jar. She thought about Elroy, with his clinical certainty, labeling her empty. She thought about Daphne stepping forward, chin high, scent broadcasting everything the pack wanted to hear. Then she thought about the hum of the ward around this hall, the dream of roots, the warmth below her navel, steady as a heartbeat. I'll stay, she said, for now, on my terms. On your terms, he agreed, and his hands, she noticed, were shaking again. The days that followed were quiet in the way that growth is quiet, invisible on the surface, relentless underneath. Shauna explored Alaric's shelves with the systematic hunger of a healer let loose in a library. She found preparations she'd only read about in the oldest pack texts, the ones Elroy dismissed as mythology, like in root tonics that strengthened warding resonance, bone marrow salves that accelerated healing at the cellular level, a crystallized resin she couldn't identify that hummed when she held it, a high, sweet vibration that made the fox's ears prick up and the warmth in her abdomen pulse in answer. Alaric taught her, not with the condescension of a master to a student, but with the focused equality of one healer recognizing another. He showed her which roots to harvest by moonlight and which by dawn. He taught her the old binding words that sealed the tincture's potency, not magic in the theatrical sense, but a resonant frequency, a vibration keyed to the preparation's chemical structure that locked it at peak efficacy. He taught her, and she taught him. Modern techniques he'd never encountered, plant hybridizations the southern packs had developed, extraction methods that made his eyebrows rise in genuine surprise. They worked side by side at the stone table, hands moving in parallel rhythms, and the space between them was not distance, but respect. and the warmth of it was steady and real. On the third night, she woke to pain, not her own, Alaric's. She felt it through the ward, a jagged spike of wrongness that cut through the humming safety of the hall like a screen through song. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, the fox at her heels, moving through the dark corridor toward the central hall where she found him, on his knees beside the hearth, his left arm laid open from elbow to wrist, the wound black at its edges in a way that no clean cut should be. What happened? He looked up and his eyes were burning, the amber gone molten, his control stretched thin over something massive and barely contained. Order probe. 3 wolves from a pack I don't recognize. They carried Ironbane blades. Ironbane, the old poison. The one substance that could wound a Lycan and keep the wound from closing. A corrupted metal that suppressed the healing resonance and let infection take root. Shauna had read about it. She had never seen its effects. The blackened edges of the wound told her everything. The tissue was dying, the corruption spreading, and Alaric's Lycan healing, the regeneration that should have closed this wound in minutes, was fighting a losing battle against the poison in his blood. She knelt beside him. Her hands moved without hesitation. Healer's hands, trained hands, stripping away the torn fabric of his sleeve, assessing the wound with her fingertips, while her mind raced through every antitoxin she knew. None of them would work. Ironbane was older than wolf medicine, older than anything in Elroy's pharmacopoeia. It required the jar, the clay jar on the shelf in her cabin at Hollow Creek, the calendula salve, her best work, brewed with moonwort and old elm bark and 11 days of patient steeping. She had left it behind. She had left it because taking it would have meant believing she'd need to heal someone, and she hadn't been able to bear that belief. And now the one thing that could save this man's arm, possibly his life if the corruption reached his heart, was sitting on a shelf in an empty cabin in a pack that had thrown her away. I need something from Hollow Creek. His jaw clenched. You can't go back there. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you that I left a salve in my workshop that can draw Ironbane corruption. It's the only thing I have that will work. I need to go get it, and I need to go now, and you need to not die while I'm gone. He stared at her, and through the pain and the failing control and the ancient, bone-deep stubbornness of a man who had survived alone for longer than most wolves lived, something yielded. Not submission. Recognition, the healer in him bowing to the healer in her. The fox knows the border paths. Follow it. She ran. The fox ran ahead of her, a rust-colored streak in the moonlight, navigating the old territory with the unerring instinct of a creature born on the margins. They reached the ward line in under an hour, and Shauna crossed it without hesitation, stepping back into Hollow Creek territory with the strange, vertiginous clarity of returning to a house you'd already mourned. Her cabin was untouched. No one had bothered to enter it, to clean it out, to claim the space. Why would they? It had belonged to the hollow wolf, the empty one, and her things carried no scent worth salvaging. The door was open. The shelves were as she'd left them. And there, in the neat row of clay and amber vessels, the jar, her best work, waiting. She grabbed it and turned and nearly collided with Renee. The beta stood in the doorway, armed, alert, his face a mask of professional neutrality that cracked at the edges when he saw her. You shouldn't be here. I know. I need this jar. I'm leaving. His eyes dropped to her midsection. She was 4 days past the rejection, and the pregnancy, whatever Lycan pregnancies did, had not visibly shown. But Renee was a beta, and betas read posture and micro-expression and the 1,000 small cues that alphas were too dominant to notice. Something's different about you. Everything is different about me. It always was. Move. He moved, not because she commanded him, but because Renee, for all his complicity in her exile, had never stopped being the kind of man who stepped aside when someone walked with purpose. She passed him and ran for the ward line, and she heard him say, very quietly, to the dark behind her, "Elroy was wrong." She didn't stop. She didn't look back, but she held the words the way a seed holds rain, silently, in the dark, where growth happens. She reached the hall before dawn. Alaric was where she'd left him, his arm wrapped in a makeshift binding that was already soaked through, the corruption spreading in dark tendrils up toward his shoulder. His breathing was shallow. The amber in his eyes had dimmed to a low flicker. The fox crouched beside him, its body pressed against his ribs, as if its small warmth could hold back what was coming. Shauna opened the jar. The calendula salve gleamed gold in the hearth light, and when she spread it along the edges of the wound, the resonance hit her like a wave. The salve's frequency locking into the ironbane corruption like a key into a lock, neutralizing it on contact. The black edges paled. The dying tissue flushed pink. The corruption retreated, and in its wake, Alaric's own healing surged forward, closing the wound in a slow, visible wave that made Shauna's hands tingle and her eyes sting. He breathed, a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a body remembering how to live without fighting for it. 11 days of steeping, she murmured, smoothing the last of the salve along the sealed wound. Wild calendula, old elm bark, rendered tallow, and I almost didn't bring it. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his arm, not gripping, not pulling, just holding, like a wound that stops aching when the right hands are near it. She let him hold it. She did not pull away. "The wolves who came at you," she said after a time. "You said you didn't recognize the pack." "I recognize the blades. Ironbane hasn't been forged in decades. Someone is making it again. Someone who knows what I am and wants the old blood to end." Elroy. The name dropped from her mouth before she'd fully formed the thought, but once it was out, she saw it. The physician who had diagnosed her Barren, who had advocated for her severance, who had access to the oldest pack texts and the knowledge to identify what they meant. Elroy, who had known exactly what the Wren line was and had declared it defective anyway. He knew what I was. He knew what the Wren blood could do. And he told Xaden I was worthless because a Lycan heir born to Hollow Creek would have broken the blight, healed the wards, and ended whatever leverage your physician has been building. Alaric's voice was flat, the careful neutrality of a man who has seen this pattern before. Whoever controls the cure controls the pack. Elroy doesn't want the blight healed. He wants to be the one who decides if it is. The scope of it settled over Shauna like cold water. Not a mistake. Not ignorance. A strategy. Elroy had identified the Lycan dormancy in her blood, understood its implications, and systematically buried it under a diagnosis of barrenness to ensure that the one person who could end his influence would be removed before she could. And Xaden, who trusted his physician because trust was easier than understanding, had done exactly what Elroy needed, cast out the cure and declared it defective. "I need to..." She stopped. Need to what? Warn them? Save them? The pack that had watched her exiled with comfortable silence? The Alpha, who had severed her bond in front of everyone? The physician, who had lied to destroy her? What did she owe them? The warmth in her abdomen pulsed. The child. The heir. The creature growing inside her, whose gifts could break the blight and restore the wards and save the wolves who had thrown its mother away. She pressed her hand there and felt the answer she didn't want to feel. That the child's power was not about debt, and withholding it to punish the pack would make her the kind of person who measured the worth of healing by whether the patient deserved it. She was a healer. Healers didn't choose. Healers treated what was in front of them. But she was also a woman who had been broken and remade in the space of 4 days, and she was allowed to set the terms. When the blight gets bad enough, she said slowly, Xaden will come here. Alaric nodded. He will. And he'll ask for the cure. He'll beg for it. His wolves are dying. He just doesn't know why yet. And when he does? Alaric looked at her, and in the amber depths of his eyes, she saw the thing he'd been holding back since the moment she'd crossed his border. Not possession, not desire, but the aching, terrified hope of a man who has found the one thing he cannot survive losing again. When he does, he said, you decide. Not me, not him. You. On the 6th day, Xaden came to the gate. The gate was not a literal structure. It was the place where Alaric's warding met the old ward line, a threshold in the forest, marked by 2 standing stones so ancient their surfaces had been smoothed to glass by weather and time. Shauna stood between them, the fox at her feet, and watched the alpha of Hollow Creek approach through the mist, with his beta at his side, and his pride stripped down to nothing. He looked terrible. Not injured, not weakened, but hollowed, in the way a strong thing looks when the foundation beneath it has begun to rot. His skin was sallow. His eyes, which had always carried the hard brightness of authority, were dull. Renee walked half a step behind him, and Renee looked worse. Thinner, grayer, the careful neutrality of his face replaced by something rawer and more honest. Behind them, visible through the trees, a small group of Hollow Creek wolves waited at the ward line. Some of them Shauna recognized. Wilma, 2 of the younger hunters. A pup she'd treated for fever 6 months ago, carried in its mother's arms. They looked at her with the wide, uncertain eyes of people seeing a ghost, or seeing clearly for the first time. Xaden stopped 10 paces from the standing stones. He did not cross them. His gaze moved over Shauna, her steadier posture, the color in her skin, the subtle swell beneath her tunic that was barely there but unmistakable to anyone looking. And something crumbled in his face. Not slowly, not gracefully. It came apart the way a dam does, in one catastrophic structural failure, and what flooded through the breach was not grief or guilt, but the terrible, specific anguish of a man who has just realized that the thing he destroyed was the thing he needed most. Shauna. Her name in his mouth. It used to sound like an afterthought. Now it sounded like a wound. Elroy is dead. Renee stepped forward, practical even in devastation. He tried to run when the blight accelerated, took his records with him. We found the rest after. The forged diagnostics, the correspondence with an Ironbane supplier, the suppression protocols he'd been applying to the ward stones. He'd been accelerating the blight deliberately for 2 years. To maintain leverage, Shauna finished. Renee's mouth tightened. To maintain leverage. Xaden didn't know. Xaden didn't ask. She looked at the alpha, who stood with his hands at his sides and his throat bare, the involuntary posture of a wolf surrendering authority. You didn't ask, Xaden. You took Elroy's word because it was convenient, because a barren mate was a problem with a clean solution, and a corrupt physician was a problem that required you to think. He flinched. It was a small motion, barely perceptible, but on a man who had built his entire identity on being unmovable, it was seismic. You're right. 2 words. No qualifiers, no explanations. No, but I thought, or if I'd known. She had expected arguments. She had expected him to make his case, to invoke pack law, to deploy the alpha voice that vibrated in the chest and bent lesser wolves to his will. Instead, he stood in the mist between the standing stones and gave her the only thing he had left, the raw, undecorated truth that he had been wrong, and he knew it. And knowing it had broken something in him that was not going to heal. Shauna felt the warmth in her abdomen pulse, the child responding to proximity, to the resonance of wolves nearby, to the blight sickness it could sense in their blood like a healer sensing a wound. Her hand went to her stomach, and Xaden's eyes followed the gesture, and the sound he made was so quiet she almost missed it. A low, involuntary exhalation. The sound of air leaving lungs that have forgotten how to breathe properly. The blight. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. The blight is killing us. The pups are the worst. Wilfred's daughter can't shift. 2 of the yearlings have lost their ability entirely. Elroy was suppressing it, managing it, using it as... I understand now. He was rationing the cure to control us. And now that he's gone, there's nothing holding it back. I know what the blight is, Shauna said. I know what causes it, and I know what ends it. I've known for 3 days. The silence that followed was so different from the silence at her severance. That silence had been comfortable, accepting, the quiet of people who agreed with what was happening. This silence was uncomfortable. This silence had teeth. It was the silence of a man standing before the woman he'd destroyed, learning that she held the only power that mattered, and that he had no leverage, no authority, no right to anything he was about to ask for. Alaric stood behind her, not beside her, behind. A wall of warmth and quiet strength at her back, close enough that she could feel his presence like the hum of the ward stones, but not between her and Xaden, not speaking for her, not positioning himself as her protector, or her authority, or her answer. Just there, like a door she could choose to lean against or walk through. The child I'm carrying is a Lycan heir, Shauna said, and her voice was steady, healer steady. The voice she used when she was telling someone the truth about their body, even when the truth was difficult. Its blood carries the old resonance. When it's born, its gifts can restore the ward network, purify the corrupted soil, and reverse the blight damage in every wolf it touches. It can save your pack. Xaden's throat worked. Shauna, I'm not finished. She waited. He closed his mouth. The child can save your pack, but the child is mine. Its gifts are mine to steward. Not yours, not the council's, not a bargaining chip, and not a debt repaid. If I choose to let the healing reach Hollow Creek, it will be because I am a healer, and that is what healers do. Not because you came here, not because you're sorry, not because you finally understand what you threw away. She paused, and in the pause she felt the weight of the decision. Not the decision itself, which she had already made, but the cost of it. The cost of being the kind of person who heals, even when it hurts too. The cost of extending mercy to people who did not extend it to her. The cost of knowing that saving Hollow Creek would mean her child's first act in the world, would be a gift to the people who had declared its mother worthless. And that some of those people would never fully understand what that cost her. I'll send preparations, tinctures, ward restoration compounds, instructions for application. Renee can coordinate distribution. She looked at the beta, who met her eyes with something she hadn't seen from him before. Not pity, not neutrality, but respect. The child's healing will reach the pack when it's born, but I will not return to Hollow Creek, and the child will not be raised there. This is its home. Xaden's eyes moved to Alaric, standing behind her, and what passed between the two men was not a challenge, or a threat, or any of the posturing rituals that wolves use to establish dominance. It was simpler and more devastating than that. It was one man looking at another and seeing, in the steadiness of his posture and the distance he kept from the woman he clearly loved, everything that he himself had failed to be. "You don't," Xaden started and stopped, swallowed. "You don't need my permission. For anything. I know that." "No, I don't." He nodded. It was a small motion, barely a dip of his chin, but it carried the weight of everything he was relinquishing. The mate he'd severed, the heir he'd exiled, the future he'd traded for Daphne's legible scent and Elroy's comfortable lies. He turned to go. He stopped. "The salves," he said, without turning around. "The ones you made. The ones on the shelf in your cabin. Renee's been distributing them. They're the only thing that's been helping the pups." Her throat tightened. The salves she'd left behind. The ordinary, painstaking, unremarkable work of a healer who had kept making medicine for a pack that told her she was nothing. Even the salves she hadn't thought to take because she'd stopped believing anyone would need them. "I'll send more," she said. He walked away. Renee lingered a moment longer. "Wilfred's daughter," the beta said quietly. "The one who can't shift. She's 7. She asked me to tell you that the fever medicine you made her tasted like pond water, and she wants to know if the next batch can taste like berries." Shauna's eyes burned. She pressed her lips together and nodded, and Renee turned and followed his alpha back through the mist, and the standing stones hummed softly as the Hollow Creek wolves retreated beyond the ward line, carrying nothing with them but the knowledge that the woman they'd exiled held their survival in her hands and had chosen, freely, to open them. The fox sneezed. Shauna looked down at it, this scruffy, torn-eared, unbeautiful creature that had followed her across a border because it couldn't read scent either, and had therefore never learned to judge her for not carrying any. And she laughed. It was a rough, damp sound, more sob than laugh, but it was real. And Alaric's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady, and the ache behind her sternum, the one that had been quiet since her first night in the old territory, did not return. That evening, Shauna sat at the stone table in the great hall, grinding moonwort root and blending it with calendula oil and the crystallized resin that hummed when she touched it. The fox slept by the hearth, its belly full, its torn ear twitching in a dream of rabbits or warmth, or whatever small foxes dream when they feel safe for the first time. Alaric sat across from her, rolling dried herbs between his scarred fingers, and the firelight moved across the ancient walls, and the jars and the shelves, and the two healers working in silence that was not empty but full. The specific silence of two people who have found the thing they were built for, and are doing it in the same room. She thought about the cost, the real cost, not the dramatic kind, not the exile or the confrontation or the ancient bloodlines and their ancient politics, but the quiet daily cost of being a person who heals. It meant her child's first gift would go to people who hurt her. It meant she would send salves to a pack that had watched her severance in comfortable silence. It meant, for the rest of her life, that the healer in her would override the wound in her, and the wound would not always agree, and she would do it anyway. That was the bitterness and the sweetness. That was the cost she accepted, not because it was fair, but because it was hers. Alaric looked up from his work. The amber in his eyes caught the firelight, moving in its slow, deep currents, and his mouth curved in the not-quite smile she was beginning to understand was the closest thing to joy a man who'd been alone for a century could safely express. "The resin you're using," he said. "You're blending it at the wrong ratio." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm blending it at a ratio that accounts for wolf-Lycan metabolic differences, which your original preparation doesn't." He paused, looked at her jar, looked at his, looked back at her, with an expression she could only describe as a man encountering the novel experience of being wrong about a tincture and finding that he did not mind at all. "Show me." She showed him, and outside the ancient hall, beyond the moss-covered ruins and the standing stones and the ward line and the mist, the blight went on killing, slow and patient and certain. But not for much longer, not with a healer's hands at work, not with a fox asleep by the fire, not with a child growing in the quiet dark, carrying in its blood the resonance of something older and better than the world that had tried to throw its mother away. I keep thinking about Wilfred's daughter, the 7-year-old who can't shift, and whose only request was that her medicine taste like berries. Something about that stayed with me long after the rest of the story settled. If you were Shauna, sealing that jar for a pack that let you go, what would it cost you? I'd love to know. See you in the next story.